Welcome, everyone. This is the evening event for our, or perhaps it's a daytime event, depending on where you're at, for our network or UDL Summit on Demand. So this is actually our third annual Network and Learn Live. So we are delighted to be here. For us in the United States, it's the evening. So for some of us, it's been kind of a long day, but I know we're going to find that new energy as we come together today and celebrate UDL. We have two very special guests with us tonight. So you're going to have an opportunity to hear Dr. Loui Lord Nelson do a live session of her UDL in 15 minutes. So we are just delighted to have her. A little bit about Louie in case you are new to UDL and maybe haven't heard about her. I know all of our UDL folks who've been around for a while certainly know about Louie. She's left her mark, a huge mark on the field of universal design for learning. So I'm gonna just tell you a little bit about Louie's background and then give her a minute to share, and then I'll introduce our second guest as well. So Louie started in education in 1991 as a special education assistant. And then she went on and got her master's degree and worked as an 8th grade collaborative teacher. And then decided that she would leave the classroom and get her doctorate, and did that at the University of Kansas, and worked with students worked with post-secondary students and worked with students after graduation. And then she had a chance to come back to K-12 in 2008 because she really wanted to put her passion of ensuring that all kids are prepared for post-secondary world into action. At that time, she worked at Bartholomew Consolidated School Corporation, otherwise known as BCSC. And any of you, again, who are well versed in UDL know that BCSC is been long implementing universal design for learning with so much success. Lots of the sessions that you participated in through the course of the week were hosted by folks from BCSC. I saw many of BCSC staff and administration in the chats and watching on live. So Louis worked there for quite a long time until 2012, and she was their UDL coordinator. And I believe it was with you, Louis, that got started at Bartholomew. And I'll let you tell us a little bit more about that, right?
Yep.
Then you had a chance to, you were awarded a postdoctorate fellowship to work with CAST and along with the CAST staff for a few years. And then, of course, Louie is the author of many best-selling books on universal design for learning, Design and Deliver. It is her most recent book. Is that right, Louie?
That was the first one, actually.
That was the first one. Then, okay.
Yeah.
And then she's had several books since then, and is the initiator and proprietor of UDL in 15 minutes, which you'll get to see tonight. So Louie, welcome. Please fill in the gaps for us. Your UDL history is long, and we would love to hear about how you got started.
Oh, wow. My pathway is not very direct, I guess. So that journey really did start with BCSC. Right before working for Bartholomew Consolidated, I was actually an interim executive director of a lobbying organization here in the state of Indiana. And when I took that role, when I walked into the office the first day, there was a shelf that had the same book, like a whole shelf of it. And it was Teaching Every Student in the Digital Age, which was CAST's original, kind of like their first book about universal design for learning. And I was coming into an organization that had been shuttered for a little bit. And so I really didn't have anybody to kind of get a playbook from. And when I saw that shelf had all of these copies, I thought that's probably an important book to read. So I think I'll read it. And so I opened it up, started reading it, and then realized, oh, universal design for learning. We talked about this when I was at KU, but didn't really get into it. Read it, was in love with it, and it's just kind of all serendipitous because literally within 15 days, I met George Van Horn, who is the director of exceptional Director of Special Education. I can't remember exceptional learners, but anyway, down at BCSC, and began a collegial, good connection relationship there. And it was soon after that that they said, "Hey, we have created this position. Do you want to interview for it?" And I did, and so then that began. And it began as a part-time position, but very quickly, I mean, within months, it was kind of like, oh, this needs to be full-time, because it was working with their 750 staff members to help everyone learn about universal design for learning. They had already been on their journey for a while, but they knew that what they wanted to accomplish, they needed to have somebody lead that effort. And so, like many people probably at this summit, and people within the world of UDL that are especially passionate about it, it made sense to me. It just, when I read about it, I thought, well, gosh, this just, we should all be doing this. And so then I had my big awakening, right, within maybe the first 2 months of, okay, not everybody thinks that. And so I need to revise the way I'm going after this. And we didn't have conversations at that time about learner variability. That wasn't in the vernacular yet. We just, the checkpoints had essentially just become a part of the vernacular. It was really about representation at the far left, action and expression and engagement. So it was far more global at that point. And so that made the message a little more challenging for some folks to, to hear and receive. So I'll just stop there, in the sense of, I'm sure there's it's sort of a question. I've left a gap somewhere, I'm sure.
No, I think that's a really nice painting of what it was like in the beginning before the guidelines. There actually was UDL before the guidelines. So thank you for sharing that, Louie. And I'm just going to share with guests the format of our evening tonight so they have an understanding of what's going to happen next. So we're going to talk with Louie for the first 15 or 20 minutes or so ago, and from now, and give you a chance to ask some questions. So feel free to pop stuff in the chat if you want to ask Louie about podcasting, or about telling her stories, or about us telling our stories about UDL. Please put those in the chat, and we will field those and ask those of Louie. After that, 15 minutes or so, we'll pause, and then Louie is going to interview our other guest, Cherie Smith. And she will introduce Cherie and tell you who Cherie is, and then we'll listen. We'll sort of be flies on the wall and listen to the interview, and we'll have a chance after the interview is over to ask both Cherie and Louie any follow-up questions that come up. Cherie about her work, or anything that you're interested in, what she has to say, and then of course Louie about her work as a podcast host, or her body of work in UDL. So that's kind of how we'll roll tonight. So we'll take the next 10 minutes to 15 minutes just talking with Louie, and then asking any questions. So if you've got questions about what you'd like to know about podcasting or telling your story, please put those in the chat, and I'll start us off. So Louie, you told us a little bit about your UDL journey, and that it began even before the guidelines. We have a few people in the chat who said, I remember that. I'm amongst you guys. I remember actually before the guidelines came out. Yeah, that was very difficult to actually get people to buy in, as you're suggesting, Louie. It's hard to hang your hat on some just theory. But what I'd love to hear is if you could just tell us a little bit about your history with podcasts, the podcast you chose, and why you chose it to be 15 minutes.
Sure. So I will say that I have well, is this going to sound more organized than it is? So I call it my idea book. If you saw it, you would notice that it's full of sticky notes and loose pieces of paper, and it's not pretty. I am not like a Pinterest person at all. But literally 4 years ago. I don't know. I didn't look back in there, 4.5. Anyway, I thought a podcast would make sense, but I don't even know where to get started. And um, it just kind of it came in and then wrote it down, but was just overwhelmed with what I was doing and busy with. And a little over 2 years ago, I can tell you exactly what road I was on, what part of the road I was on. I was driving home from the gym in the morning, and it just hit me. You need to do a podcast. You need to start it. That podcast needs to be about 15 minutes long. And well, UDL in 15 minutes, that sounds like a really good title. So I think I'm going to go that direction. So the 15 minutes just was because I felt like uh, in the process of saying what I wanted to do, I knew that people could share a story that was compact enough, but that felt doable, that felt feasible, that felt like a starting point, and that 15 minutes would be enough time to just to touch on that and to get into it and to have some examples. And over time of layering many of these together, that people could just hear lots of different examples. I always knew that I wanted to interview educators from the classroom or in schools, or who were working directly with educators. I knew that I wanted to interview people who this was every day for them. I think, well, I know that we have millions of educators, millions and millions all over the world, who do great things every single day. It's a part of their norm. And I wanted to normalize that norm. I want to make it a part of the everyday. And so that was a key part of this design. And I also knew that I would be tapping on colleagues and friends especially in the beginning, to say, hey, can you connect me with folks? Because I could use my Rolodex, but then just reaching out to people. And I'll talk about the design and the kind of the UDL part of it in a minute. When it came to learning about how to podcast, it was me and Google, right? I just went out and started looking up things, ratings, finding what tools were out there, what supports were out there. I didn't have a website at that time. I had never taken that step. And so I turned to some friends who are very good with web design, and then turned to the AIM Center and looked at resources there to make sure that I was going to create a web experience that was fully accessible. And that was interesting because it's a friend of ours who builds websites. That's a part of his job, right? That's his marketing firm. And when I brought him these specifications, the first words were, "Oh, we're used to accessibility." And I was like, really? Okay, well, would you just please read these, please. And honestly, there was some, we had to go back and forth on this. But yeah, I had to do some advocating. It's not that they were saying no, but it was a level of accessibility that isn't unfortunately standardized yet. So I said, be leaders in your field, adopt this. So that gives you just kind of a picture of how I wanted to set things up. I have a picture that's floating out there. When I started doing these recordings, I was sitting in my walk-in closet, because that's good for sound. Now I've graduated to a space at my desk. So that's, I guess, helpful. But there's that. So I can talk about the design of using UDL within the podcast design. You want me to do that next?
I think that would be great. I just want to make a couple of comments. In your beginning opening statement, you were saying that, this sort of all came to you at once, and then you started to talk, and I could hear that intentionality. I could hear you saying, we did it with purpose, and the purpose was to make it easy for our guests and our listeners and our guests, right? Make it manageable. So I was very impressed with the strategy that you used to put that together. And just, the idea that you're being resourceful as a learner as well. How else do we learn anything? Google and YouTube, right? Without that, where would we be?
I
Um,
know.
I just gotta mention a cute comment that Jose said. Blackerby said that most of us can still pay attention for 15 minutes. So he thought that was reasonable as well.
Yeah, that was actually part of my thinking also. I thought most people can do. I've had people who have sent me notes saying it's perfect because that's how long it takes me to wash the dishes after dinner. So they listen to the podcast to get themselves through washing dishes.
Right. So we have a few comments. One is about the design of your podcast. So a couple commenters or listeners commented that they appreciate the multiple means and the very UDL-ness of the design behind it. If you want to talk a little bit about that, and we have about 3 more other questions to that our listeners have been asking as well.
Okay. So yeah, immediately when I thought I want to do a podcast, I thought, well, there's audio, but if we're really going to talk accessibility and flexibility, we need to have these other pieces. So immediately I knew that I was going to, for example, provide a transcript. That's easy. And then, I mean, this all just kind of came flowing in. It takes about 7 minutes for me to get home from the gym. So this was all just kind of coming. And so by the time I got home, I needed to just scratch it all down. The photo montage that I created. So here's some transparency. I would love to be able to create um, like cartoon videos or graphics and all that kind of stuff. I have no talent for this. I've also not just taken the time to take any classes or do that kind of thing, but I knew I needed something visual. I knew that I wanted to develop something visual to go along with the podcast. And I thought, well, if my guests are tolerant of it, then I'm just going to ask them if they will send any kind of photos that would go along with their classrooms, with whatever they're doing, with whatever we're talking about, if they've got anything to share. I always make it clear that these photos don't have to have students in them. It's whatever their policy is within their school, within their district, and then what they're comfortable with. And then I can go out and get quite a number of images as I need to, screenshots and whatnot of websites. But I know that for some people listening for 15 minutes, they'd rather have something, a little slideshow or what have you going on in front of them. So I decided to create those. And within YouTube, of course, you can add in the captioning. So learned how to do that. And that's, part of the transcribing. So meaning I got the transcription of the podcast and I just can embed that. So I just felt that would enhance things. And then it probably was the 3rd podcast when I'd have to go back and look, but it was at the 2nd or 3rd that I thought, okay, if I'm providing a photo montage, there might be people who are interested in those photos, but have some sort of a visual need. And so I probably should add audio descriptions. So at this point, this is also when my web developer's like, really? And I'm like, yes. This is what you do around accessibility. Another teaching moment. Let's just go forward with this. So and again, not pushback of they won't do it, but it was like, really? Yes. Yeah, you should be doing this too. If you guys are producing videos on your end for your other businesses and manufacturing and whatnot, you should be doing these things too. So I think I've gotten better with audio description as I've learned about it. I continue to listen as much as I can to other audio descriptions to again get better. Same with alt text. I'm always looking at the alt text, thinking, am I that good? I need to get better at this? So it just didn't make sense for me to make a podcast about UDL and not model it in the best way I could, that I could. And it just makes sense and it feels right. And I like that I do it. Yeah.
And we like it too. We do. I think it's just a wonderful model that, as educators and UDL aficionados, we can point to it and say, this is what UDL looks like. When you're doing a podcast, this is what UDL looks like. And I love that you do it and you do it so well. And I also love that you're growing, right? That you're actually developing skills too as you work through this. And I think that's part of what happens when we put ourselves out there a little bit, right? That's when we develop as well. So we had a question from Kelly, and Kelly says that she's been working on incorporating podcasting into her classroom with her students, with her learners. She wonders if you have any advice on how to get learners invested in giving it a try. She had some success, but she's always looking for some suggestions to really get it to take hold. And she's particularly interested in your expertise.
Yeah. So actually, one of my a listener contacted me and asked if I would talk with her son, who is 10 and wanted to start his own podcast. And so that was way fun. So one of the things that we talked about was obviously passion. So, and Kelly, I assume we're talking about helping your students create their own podcast of a sort. Is what it's sounding like. So, they need to find a topic that they want to talk about enough or interview other people about. And that's what this young man and I talked about, because he was really passionate about his topic. But when I started asking him about the topic and just kind of took him down a pathway to see um, how much of that topic he could talk about, I'm just asking him just the classic who, what, when, where, why questions, right? Then we talked for about maybe 15 minutes. And I said, so do you feel like you're in the middle of what you know about this topic? Or do you feel like you're getting towards the end of what you know about this topic? Do you feel like you're at the beginning? And he said, well, I think I'm about the middle of where I know about the topic. And I said, that's a great place to be. How many podcasts do you think you want to make? And, well, I think I want to make, he said 10. I said, that's great. Would you feel comfortable talking to somebody else about your podcast? Because that could be a really nice way to get more. So you listen to somebody else talk about the topic, right? So then it became a conversation about how do you interview somebody? Well, you interview somebody by listening to them. And you come to that interview with some questions prepared, but you always have a question of why in your head or how in your head, and you're listening to them and then you want to dig deeper, and you just might hear a little thing. So we practiced that a little bit. And I think like the third question he asked me, I was like, that's a zinger. That's a great question, right? So our students need to learn what good interview questions are to model for them, right? It's mastery-oriented feedback. They need to have modeled for them a quality question that allows their guest to expand and talk more about that topic. I think also, and it depends on the students. I can tell you that my personality, I wanted to get it right. That's a, I admit that, right? So I don't think I'm a perfectionist. Again, if you like looked at my idea book and other things in my life, you'd be like, oh, she's not a perfectionist. But there are things that I'm really picky about. And I think that's what kept me from being a podcaster for a long time. So I needed to release some of that. And I think our students need to have some practice in releasing that. They can start practicing with a tape recorder. I think podcasting gets a little nervous they get a little nervous for it when they think, oh my gosh, it's going to go out and the world is going to hear it. Because when you press that button, it's a little nerve wracking, right? Because you're like, okay, here comes the judgment, right? So having the students practice with tape recorders, and sharing those back and forth. They're not tape recorders, and these days it's all digital, right? But so easy to share those voice files. Flipgrid, my gosh, that's an easy way to start practicing with a podcast. Is just using something like Flipgrid. So I think finding that topic, having them investigate, and giving them a series of who, what, when, why, who, what, when, where, why questions, so they can start investigating their own depth of knowledge, having them give their own gauge of where they are within their depth at the beginning, at the middle, at the end. Do they want to interview other people? Helping them learn about good question asking. And then also articulating how many. Yeah, I think those would be good steps. So I hope that was good, Kelly. You can always email me and ask me more specific questions. I promise I will answer them.
Louie, that was absolutely awesome. I'm sure Kelly's going to be delighted with your answers. Completely exactly what we needed to hear. So thank you for that. So part of my job is to keep an eye on the time. So there is one more question. And if it's okay with you, Rose, I'm going to hang on to that and we can ask it as a follow-up because we want to make sure that we have enough time to have Louie and Cherie have a complete interview, and then we'll I'll save that question so I haven't forgotten it, and we'll bring that back up after the interview. So Cherie, I'm just going to introduce you very briefly, and I'll let you and Louie do the rest of the talking. So we're delighted to have with us tonight Cherie Smith, and Cherie is the consultant for State Support Team 6 in Ohio. And between Louie and Cherie, they'll tell you all about Cherie's work and what she does, and you'll sit back and enjoy the interview. Again, keep questions. So if you've got questions you want to ask Cherie following the interview, or Louie, keep putting those in the chat and we'll make sure that we get those out. So I'm going to mute my microphone and give it over to the professionals.
Okay. So I'm going to let everyone on here know that I'm going to start this as if you've not heard any of this, because I'll pull this section out and it will become a UDL in 15 minutes for those people who aren't part of this live broadcast and what have you. So you're going to hear that introduction again also. And for those who listen, you won't hear the music tonight. That was a little bit beyond my technology skills. And then the second thing is that typically when I'm interviewing my guests, we don't see each other. I use a online platform where it's just us talking. We can see our little voice bubbles. So it's not a Zoom thing. So I usually have my big boom mic right here in front of me, and I've got the big old headphones that are over here. And I'm looking down and I'm taking notes as the person speaks. So that's what you're going to see me doing. When you see my head down, it's not because I'm ignoring, it's just because I am busy taking notes so that I can hopefully ask good questions, as you guys are flies on the wall. So I will do what I typically do with any of my podcasts. I'll do a countdown of 3, 2, 1 and start off as I normally would. All right, so 3, 2, 1. Hello and welcome to UDL in 15 minutes, where educators discuss their experiences with UDL. I'm Loui Lord Nelson, UDL author and leader. This episode is live in conjunction with the UDL-IRN 2020 Summit on Demand and the UDL-IRN's Network and Learn live series. But before I introduce my guest and the specific topic for this podcast, I am sharing my resolve to take action against institutionalized racism, specifically within our educational systems. And while I continue to listen and learn, I will not hide behind the luxury of getting it right. I will be out there, and I hope you join me. But for this podcast, I'm talking with Cherie Smith, who is a regional consultant for the State Support Team 6 and a member of the UDL Collaborative at the Ohio Center on Autism and Low Incidence, known as OCALI. And today, Cherie is going to share how one district is using an in-house practice profile on clear goals to perform fidelity checks and align their supports. So hi, Cherie, how are you?
Hi, thanks, Louie. I'm doing well. I'm happy to be here.
Oh, it's so great to talk with you. I really appreciate it. And I especially appreciate your willingness to be on a live podcast. This is, there's only one other person that's done this. So you are in a small community of people. So thank you for your bravery. So first off, if you would share a bit about the State Support Team as an organization, and then your role as a regional consultant.
Sure, sure. So in Ohio, there are 16 regions, state support team regions, and Region 6 is on the western side of the state. We support about 47 school districts, and we are just a part of a state system of support that collaborates with schools, families, and other regional partners um, through a continuous improvement process. And our charge is really to ensure that each child, and that's part of our strategic plan, that language, each child, our future, that each child has access to high quality education. So we do that through leadership development. We support team development. We try to build capacity, professional capital within our teams, and also inclusive instructional practices such as universal design for learning.
Yeah, so your role is really broad. I feel like we're tapping into, it's dangerous to put a percentage to it because then it sounds like it's weighted, but it sounds like this is a corner, like this is like a 20% or something, because it sounds so broad. Am I right?
Yeah, so there are different hats that I wear. I support districts in special education, post-secondary transition, but it's almost like once you see the framework, you can't unsee it. And so it, to me, sort of bleeds into all those other areas, you know, helping students prepare for life after school transition, right, is really helping them become an expert learner and learning what skills work for them and what skills are going to translate. So I see it reaches multiple areas.
Yeah, I love what you just said. Like once you see the framework and you start to really understand it, you just can't unsee it. It's there. And maybe people who aren't as used to it or aren't as invested in it yet, you can potentially get under their skin because you're like, oh, it just so connects here and it's it's this and that and the other. It really is.
From time to time. Yeah. It's UDL. What? No.
I know. So what route did you take to get to this point as part of the state support team?
Well, so some of my formal or graduate training was around educational leadership, but also curriculum and instruction around the idea of the inclusive classroom. And a lot of my experience has been, it started out in special ed. I was exceptional school education ESE teacher and school specialist in Florida and consultant. I found that I was oftentimes offering and working with teachers in ways to improve what they were doing in their classroom for students with disabilities, but then we were finding ways that would translate to all students. And so when I heard of UDL, when I first heard of it, it just clicked. Like, oh, of course, that totally makes sense. And then I was really excited about going back into the classroom to be a co-teacher because then I wasn't just coming from special ed. I felt like I could really have a conversation about all students. My co-teachers embraced that. I had some really wonderful teachers that I taught with. And so that idea of becoming an instructional coach just started to come about. And then when the state support team was hiring, it just appealed to me, you know, really. And now instead of just working with one district, I could work with multiple districts and just impact so many more students. So I was really excited. I just jumped on that opportunity and I love it.
Yeah, I agree with you in that the being able to spread it, being able to spread your experiences, but then also see the impact across several different sites can be really exciting and I think fulfilling.
Yeah.
So in this life that you have of supporting these different districts, you have one district who you worked, and I know you worked with a lot of them on this kind of change, but one who specifically adopted the action of a practice profile, and they chose to focus on clear goals. And that was kind of the story that you were going to share. So I guess starting off with maybe, I know you did a session earlier, go ahead and reference that so people can go back and find it if you've purchased the access to this week's conference, which is so worth it, then you would be able to go back and see Cherie's series from, presentation from earlier this week. But you can reference that and then just get into like what a practice profile is and tell the story.
Okay, yeah. So the presentation, we both had a hard time saying that, didn't we? The presentation from this on-demand summit was from the UDL-IRN Implementation SIG, and I believe the title was Implementation at All Levels, Classroom to the Capital. And it does come from that place of, how do we support implementation in all classrooms, in all buildings, in all districts, across the region, across the state, across our country. So really implementation at all levels. And the idea for a practice profile came about, and I really became interested in it in many different ways. I found that when I would train teachers, and it was so interesting what you said about kind of before the guidelines, even with the guidelines, which were designed to be in like teacher friendly language, it still seemed very conceptual to them. And they really had a hard time with it. I had one teacher tell me, you're a very lovely person, but you speak in riddles. What does this mean in my classroom? And so I realized they needed something a little bit more descriptive that focused on adult actions. And that's really what a practice profile is. You find an innovation and you define it. So what does it look like? What are the core components? And most of the practice profiles I've seen have included clear goals as a core component or a critical component for UDL, that you kind of have to have clear goals. They often have, you need to use multiple means. You need to build that expert learner. So there have been a variety of them kind of created. The UDL Collaborative from Ohio, we created one and kind of went through that process so that we would be better willing, or not willing, but able, I guess, to help our districts do it. And so I'm working with one district that really took a hold of it. And they really liked the idea of defining it so that it was something that teachers could practice, they could observe. It was very doable, actionable, measurable. And so they tried to define what they wanted and what their expectations were around clear goals. And actually their strategy is a 3-part strategy, but so far they've only defined clear goals and they've been able to implement that. They're working with their district leadership team. I think just this year they're defining the second piece, and then the following year we'll design the third. So it's a multi-year process to sort of begin to create this. They looked at research, kind of pulled in, what does the research say? What does it look like? And then began to just use it. So, what would this look like if we were going to observe everybody doing it? And so the practice profile was really that starting point. Each building kind of developed a sort of look for, if we go in the classroom, we want to see these things, and then they did it. And of course, you learn so much from that. Then you start to get a little bit of nuanced details. At each building, it's going to look a little different, right? Because you're applying a framework, and it doesn't look the same. Every classroom doesn't look the same. Right. So it's been really exciting to see that.
I think what I love practice profiles, and I've seen yours, and that we have them. And for those who are listening, you're going to see examples. So Cherie's going to share the ones that she's talking about here. I know we can connect you with probably some from the Ohio Collaborative. I'm going to share one that Michael McSheehan and I have put together on the kind of the combination of MTSS and UDL. And as Cherie and I have talked about before, these take a long time to develop because you're doing such deep thinking about these things. But the thing that I really like about practice profiles is it's a rubric for adults, right? And we have all contributed to it in a sense of being able to articulate what is that full implementation? What are we looking for? And then what are the things that help us know we're on the way getting there? And so maybe share some of the conversations or some of the ways that you help guide people in that conversation of how do they know they're getting there? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So Well, one of the ways is to go and observe, and are we seeing the same thing? It's sort of that fidelity check, and then to have discussions around it. So you look at the data, and sometimes data is a scary word. So sometimes I say evidence. Look at the evidence. Look what you collected, and have a conversation about it. It's sort of this iterator activity where is this what we meant? To what extent? You know, are we there yet? And it's that iterative sort of UDL process. Okay, no, so let's define it a little bit more. Let's sort of talk about what worked and what didn't, and let's try it again, and then kind of pull that data again, and kind of keep going through that process, that continuous improvement process, so that we are really ramping up our fidelity. One thing that the district did that I really loved is they created a very beautiful visual for what it looked like at various levels of implementation. So for each, their component was clear goals, and they had sort of subcomponents. And for each of those subcomponents, they had a description of what it looked like along the way. So you could sort of see if you were moving towards that full level of implementation, that high fidelity. And one thing that I love that they did was they started to link resources. So, you know, we're not sure we have this yet, but here's a few resources. Here's some videos of some teachers teaching. Here's an article that explains it a little bit more. I loved that every time they mentioned multiple means in the practice profile, it linked to the guidelines, which links to the research. So you can keep digging down. If you're that person that wants more details and wants to know more, it's there for you. And they made that available for their district.
The other thing I like about the practice profile process, and it sounds like this group was definitely going through it. So when we take this back to the framework, right, that's that level of recruiting interest is just the rock solid center of this, because there's the authenticity of understanding what you're looking for. And the are we there yet? I always think of like the little kid in the back seat. Are we there yet? And so in the practice profile, you don't have the kid asking that question anymore, right? They figured out how to understand the mileage that's left in the trip, and that they're going to get there. And so there's that authentic understanding. And then I love this representation that they're creating, these visuals. That's beautiful. That is a wholehearted adoption of this. And then when it comes to them as practitioners, within that action and expression, they feel good about it. It feels solid. They know what they do need to do. It's a beautiful representation of the whole framework, all the way across all the guidelines and the principles.
Yeah. They actually, they have a graphics department. I think it might be in connection with their career compact or career tech center, career technical education. And so they asked a student to do that. So that was created by a student. I mean, right? I mean, just, I love it. By, through the district, they had conversations around it. So I love that piece. So I'm glad you reminded me to share that. But I would agree with you that the whole process of building a practice profile it's a learning process in and of itself, because you think you have an idea, you think you know it, but through conversation and asking questions and reflecting, everybody's knowledge grows. And it's good to have sort of those, you know, are we there yet? People, those maybe that are new, because what we found, especially in the UDL Collaborative, is we're all sort of, you know, somebody comes from each region, each of the 16 regions. So we're sort of the leaders in our region in UDL, and we think we know what we're saying, right? We think we understand it, and we do so well that when we brought some people in who were kind of new to it, we weren't as clear as we thought we were, and we had to break it down a little bit more and explain it in maybe a different way. So that's an important piece too, is to have your experts, but have those that are sort of new to the innovation or to UDL when you're creating it.
Absolutely. Well, Cherie, we have hit our 15 minutes. I knew we would. It's so easy. But I really appreciate this. I think you've given a lovely example of the practice profile. I know you've already sent me images that are going to go into the photo montage that people can look at and get some visual representations of this and have an easier time. And I always send these things out by Twitter so people will be able to contact you that way, because I know they're going to have questions. And so, and if you're willing, then we can share that information too of how to get in touch with you. But thank you so much for this.
You're welcome.
Great. And so I will go ahead and do my typical closing of for those listening to the podcast, you can find supplemental materials like an image montage with closed captioning, that montage with audio descriptions, a transcript, and associated blog at my website, which is theudlapproach.com. And then finally, if you have a story to share about UDL implementation for UDL in 15 minutes, contact me through the UDL approach. And thanks to everyone for your work in revolutionizing education through UDL and making it our goal to develop expert learners. The end. Yay. Oh, Cherie, that was wonderful. So you guys are going to get a picture of this too, because after we stop the recording for every podcast, I always sit and chat with the guest. So if it's okay, Sue, I just want to point out, Cherie, that was awesome. Again, thank you so much. This was a level of bravery that was outstanding. And I loved the examples, just the way that you talked about the practice profile as a lovely way to get deeper into the conversation, because at the heart of it, that's what it's about. It really is, and helps define that. So I'll say thank you, and then I'll stop there and let Sue move into her role.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you both, Louie and Cherie. That was amazing. As Mackenzie said, it's so fun to see behind the scenes how this works. And Louie, just to watch your skill at interviewing. So I was thinking back to Kelly asking about, how do I get my kids podcasting? Well, maybe we need to have them watch this and watch Louie in action. That would be a nice model to see. And Cherie, I really loved what you had to say about the visual representations from your practice profiles. It occurs to me well, I'll save my question for in a moment. But so I would just like to say to the audience, we have a good 10 minutes left. And so I would love to hear what your questions are for either Louie or Cherie about the practice profiles, or Louie about her work with the podcast. So go ahead and put those in the chat if you have something you'd like to hear about. And I'll start us off with a quick question for Cherie. And then Rose, I'm not forgetting that you have one still in there for Louie. So Cherie, as I was listening to you talk about those practice profiles, you talked about them, as a roadmap or like a blueprint for teams as they're trying to describe what it is they're aiming for. And I love that idea that, as they're doing it, they're learning. That's where some of the learning happens. You actually learn get deeper understanding about UDL by actually plotting it out and making those ideas visual. I'm wondering if you could help us. You mentioned that you co-construct these with teams. Could you share with us some of the strategies that you use to ensure that all voices get heard in that construction? Because I know that can be a challenge, especially in varying levels of expertise.
Right. That's a really good question, because you do want all voices to be heard. And so one of the strategies that we used in the UDL Collaborative, and I think sometimes we're better than others, is that we have a process observer, and we have some really good process observers. So, we've sort of defined that we have somebody who is looking at the meeting through that lens, and that has helped us to ensure that all voices are heard. And just when you're looking at sort of identifying the core components, a lot of people have ideas, and so we put them up, we considered them, we talked about them, we tried to align them, and it took time. Louie, I don't know if your process was something similar, but it did. We didn't come to all of the ideas right away. We had to begin to define them. Some of them we combined because it made sense, and some of them we broke apart because once we started to make those subcomponents and really start to define it, we felt that it needed it to be its own component.
That's great. Louie's saying that her comment was process observers. That's such a smart thing to have. That's wonderful. Mackenzie says there's some questions from our Twitter viewers. So Mackenzie, go ahead.
Yeah, so Cherie, there's just a question from Twitter for you. And the question was, what resources are you using? What are your go-to resources for your work?
Okay, well, that's a really good question too. I do a lot of different PDs, and I always, professional development opportunities, and I always ask, what was helpful. And so definitely the guidelines, a favorite is always Katie Novak has translated the guidelines and she shared them with us. She said she created it for her mother. Because she was so excited. She told her mom about the guidelines and her mom said, Kitty, I don't know what you're talking about. And so she made it kind of like a mother friendly, her mom's a teacher. So definitely those two are ones that folks like. Most recently, the flow chart is helpful and through Novak Consulting, I think. And then we also had the critical elements. And I'm forgetting who that's from, but it's linked in one of our practice profiles, so I can make sure to share that out with you, because those critical elements were similar to what we were thinking as far as critical components. So those were just some of the resources that we used in creating the practice profile, and that I've shared in other districts have used.
That's great. Those are some great ones too that you listed off. One other question from Twitter is, you talked about your UDL implementers SIG, and can you talk a little bit about the past work that you've done with them and then kind of the future outlook on where you're planning on going?
Yeah, so the first year of the SIG, we started to explore this idea of a practice profile, and it was interesting because that first year of the SIG, we only had 3 core components, and so the UDL Collaborative, we had 5. Both had clear goals, and so we wanted to present on that, and then, okay, so now that you have this practice profile, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to use it? You don't want to put all this time into a tool and then it just sits on the shelf. And so we tried to link that with the implementation drivers. So how does this practice profile inform, for example, coaching? And so the session that I presented in the on-demand summit a few days ago was around using the practice profile for coaching. So you're working with a teacher and identifying an area of weakness, perhaps, and you're helping give specific feedback around those pieces that they've identified as a need. So that's something we might consider in the future. Do we want to jump in and just work on coaching? Do we want to look at how other drivers are impacted by the practice profile? For example, the one district that I shared, their goal for the district-wide fidelity check came from the performance assessment driver. In the initial implementation stage, you're doing it frequently, and that was their goal. They said, we want to get there district-wide. We want to be observing all teachers and get that data. So that was kind of a driving factor for them.
That's great. And Sue, I think you mentioned another question for Louie from Rose.
That's right. So we do have a question. Rose was asking Louie if, and I'm going to scroll up in my chat to find it specifically, but it was about the questions that you asked presenters. She wants to know, do you have a set of interview questions that you've asked of teachers who you reached out to? Do you observe their classrooms when you can?
So within my process of the podcast, I decided, again, within the design, that I first meet with all of my guests via Zoom. These are people, I interview people from all over the world, so I don't get to be in their classrooms. But I think it's incredibly important that we build a rapport first. And so we meet via Zoom or Skype. I prefer that we see each other. And the purpose of that is to minimize threats and distractions. I'm going after that because it's you can be nervous to be a guest, right? You want to come up with the right words and all this kind of stuff. So we go through the process, what it looks like. And one of the things that I tell everyone is the whole thing is editable. I can edit. That is the wonderful thing about audio. And then what we do is we narrow the story, because sometimes people have a really broad story. So I need to make sure that we're going to fit in the 15 minutes. And I bring some set questions, introductory. We decide on a couple of them that will get started, but then I always give fair warning that as I'm listening, I'll have some other stuff. But the hope is that we've built, again, that rapport within our conversation, and I'm not going to give them a zinger. The point is to continue a conversation. So of my questions, I would say 2 or 3 of them, we know what they're going to be, and then I'm a loose cannon. So
I love that. So we have just a few minutes left. We have about 4 minutes, and I just want to invite both of you to share some parting words with our listeners during this presentation. So if Cherie, if you'd like to start, and then we'll let Louie close us out.
Well, I guess one thing that I think Louie kind of mentioned this too is just try. You know, if you're worried, just take that first step. It doesn't have to be perfect, because through that practice and reflection and trying different things and learning, you're going to get better. So just try it. Just go out and try it. Ask for feedback. Ask for people to observe you and give you, you know, kind of specific feedback if that's what you want. And it makes it much easier. It's scary to jump in sometimes, but trust me, it's worth it.
Thank you, Cherie. And Louie, we do have a question about your background. I think Mackenzie answered it for you, saying that it's Uganda, but maybe you'd like to say a little bit more about that. And then anything you would like to share as we close out.
yeah, I just had typed in there. So I did work last year a few times in Uganda and in the rural areas. And I love sharing pictures from places in the world that I don't know that everyone gets to go, or maybe they have an image in their head of what it looks like. And this is so much of Uganda, and it's gorgeous and it's lush and beautiful and peaceful in many ways. And so I just like using that as my background photo. That's where I am right now. So because I can't travel right now, I just have it behind me. And then otherwise, I'm always going to put the pitch out there. If you want to be interviewed, I would love to hear from you, because everybody needs to hear these stories. They need to hear them, because we need to normalize universal design for learning. And what better way to normalize it than to tell these kinds of stories?
I agree. And thank you both for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. I know it's been, like I mentioned, a long day. And we really do appreciate you sharing with us. We've got wonderful comments in the chat thanking you both. So I hope everyone has a wonderful end to your day. And if you're watching this virtually, perhaps the beginning to your day. We do have one more day of the UDL-IRN Summit on Demand. So those of you who are have already enrolled, we can't wait to do it again tomorrow. For those of you who may be watching and have not enrolled yet, there's still time. All of the sessions are available and archived, and all the great things you've been hearing about are still available for everyone to participate in. So we invite you to go ahead and jump onto the UDL-IRN site and get yourself a ticket in. Thank you, Mackenzie, Cherie, Louie, for joining me tonight.
You're welcome. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.